As the golden glow of autumn slowly faded, the world began to hush. In the medieval countryside, where the hills rolled gently beneath the pale sky and the trees whispered their final rustling prayers, there came a time each year when the warmth loosened its grip. The air grew crisper, not yet biting, but no longer kind. Fields once green with promise turned to shades of ochre and ash. The harvest, such as it was, had been gathered, bundled in straw, and stored behind wooden doors. There was little to do but wait for the silence of snow. In those days, time was measured not in minutes, but in seasons, and few seasons were more feared, more deeply respected than winter. The peasants, those who tilled the land and turned the earth, watched the skies with reverence. They knew the omens, a thickening of morning mist, the brittle crack of frost underfoot, the strange low cry of birds who did not flee southward. These were signs. They marked the shift from hope to endurance. Medieval winters did not announce themselves in storms. No, they crept in gently, like a soft-spoken guest who overstays their welcome. First came the shortening days, when the sun dipped beneath the horizon before the second meal. Then, the hearth fire was fed more often, and the smell of wood smoke clung to every surface. Bread grew tougher, water cooler, and in the small stone cottages scattered across the manorial lands, preparations began not with haste, but with solemnity. A family might gather around a table made rough with age, lighting a single candle to stretch the shadows back. The father, gaunt from work, would patch the holes in the roof with dried reeds. The mother, shoulders bent from labor, would soak beans in cold water, praying the yield might last. Children, wide-eyed but quiet, would press their palms against the window's glass, their breath fogging up the only pain they had. Outside, the land settled into its slumber. This was a season not merely of hardship, but of waiting, and with the waiting came reflection. In these early days of winter, before the true cold had set in, there was a strange stillness. Life slowed. The fields were no longer tilled. The animals moved more slowly. Even the streams, once babbling with summer's song, grew sluggish, burdened by the chill that thickened them. For many, this was the only time they had to rest their bones. Yet that rest came with a quiet dread, like the moment before a storm breaks. The nobility, tucked away in stone keeps and timber halls, fared better, but even they could not fully escape the reach of the cold. Their meals were richer, their cloaks thicker, but the damp still clung to the walls. The tapestries, woven with gold and dyed with indigo, swayed gently in drafty corridors. Servants scurried to keep fires alive in hearths that burned day and night. But no fire could truly warm a hall built for summer pageants and spring hunts. Winter demanded humility from all who lived within its reach. Even the church bells sounded different as the cold took hold, more distant, more solemn. The monks in their abbeys and the nuns in their cloisters chanted psalms with cracked lips, their breath visible as incense in the cold air. Prayer became a shield against the creeping sense of isolation. For the poor, however, prayer was often all they had. The people of the land turned to ritual to ward off fear. Stories were told beside the fire, tales of saints and sinners, of wolves with glowing eyes, of spirits that roamed the woods in snow-covered cloaks. These stories passed the hours and warmed the spirit, but they also served as warnings. Because winter, though slow in its arrival, was merciless once it took hold. Yet in those quiet days, just as the last of the apples were turned to cider and the onions hung like ornaments from the ceiling beams, there was still time. Time to remember the summer just past. Time to hold one's children closer. Time to breathe in the scent of pine wood and peat, and believe that perhaps this year it would not be so bad. The past was filled with winters worse than this one, they would say. Stories of years when the snow fell in October and didn't melt until Easter. Of harvests so poor that bark had to be scraped from trees to flavour a stew. And yet, here they were, still breathing, still waiting. The medieval world was a world of patience, and nowhere was that patience more tested than in the slow, measured descent into cold. The peasants did not speak of brutality, not as we do. To them, winter was not cruel. It was simply another shape of life, another passage through which the soul must pass. To endure it was to honor one's ancestors, to prove that the blood had not thinned, that the will had not weakened. There was no escape from winter, but in those first weeks, there was still the illusion of peace, the kind that comes just before the wind changes, before the snow falls heavy, before the hunger begins to whisper in the dark corners of the room. In that quiet, medieval winter, unfolded like a dream, slow, inevitable, and full of ghostly beauty. It was a world blanketed in grey, not only in the sky above, but in the very rhythm of the day, the beginning of the cold, the end of warmth, the breath before the frost. In the quiet fold of the valley, beneath the watchful brow of distant hills now powdered with frost, there lay clusters of peasant cottages, low to the ground, slouched with age, their thatched roofs browned by smoke and rain. These homes were not built for comfort. They were built from necessity, pieced together by calloused hands, timber and wattle holding back the cold as best they could. A single room in most cases, sometimes two. One space for sleeping, one for everything else. No glass in the windows, only wooden shutters or oiled cloth, letting in just enough light and far too much chill. At the center of it all, the hearth. It was the heart of the home, its only source of warmth and a symbol of survival. A small fire burned there most days of winter, fed with branches gathered before the snow grew deep. The smoke curled upward through a hole in the roof, or drifted out from between crooked timbers, leaving the walls blackened and the air thick with soot. Families huddled close to that fire, not only for warmth, but for togetherness, for reassurance. A mother might sit nearest, mending linen or feeding the baby wrapped in rags. A father might squat beside her, his hands outstretched, his thoughts slow and heavy. The older children would crowd behind them, knees pulled to their chests. The youngest were often held on laps or kept bundled in straw-lined baskets near the flames. But the fire was never enough. Not truly. On bitter nights, the air beyond its reach turned sharp, breath misted inside the home, fingers numbed, toes ached. The cold slipped through every crack and gap, nestling into corners, settling beneath. The earthen floor, waiting at the foot of every blanket. It was a patient enemy. It did not rage. It lingered. The bedding was thin, straw mattresses stuffed with what could be gathered, often shared between many. No privacy, no luxury, just closeness and the hope that body heat might do what the fire could not. Sometimes livestock were brought inside. A pig or goat might share the living space, both for protection and for warmth. Their bodies, dense with heat, gave off a comfort crude but vital. Chickens might roost on beams overhead, their quiet clucking and scratching offering a strange kind of companionship. This mingling of human and beast was not seen as strange. It was life. It was survival. Still, the smell was strong. Dung, damp wool, smoke, and sweat. It soaked into everything, into hair, into bedding, into dreams. There were no chimneys in most peasant homes of this period. Smoke from the fire filled the air before drifting out wherever it could find space. Eyes burned, lungs wheezed. But without that fire, there would be no warmth, no boiled gruel, no baked bread. The food was simple and spare. Gruel in the morning, if the grain supply was holding. A hunk of coarse rye bread later in the day. If lucky, perhaps a scrap of salted pork or hard cheese carried over from the autumn stores. Most evenings, a broth thin and sour, flavoured with onions or herbs dried in summer. Yet it was the hearth that made these meagre meals bearable. Its flickering light softened the faces around it, casting shadows that moved like slow dancers on the walls. Here, amid the smoky hush, songs were sung, stories whispered, and prayers murmured. The home became a sanctuary, not because it kept the cold entirely out, but because it kept the family together. Outside, the world was a frozen wilderness. Inside, it was close, heavy, and sacred, and yet, even here, danger dwelled. Fires sometimes died in the night, their coals buried in ash too soon. Then came the scramble to relight them, sometimes with flint and steel, sometimes with embers borrowed from a neighbour's hearth. Cold fingers worked in desperation. A night without fire could mean sickness, or worse. Children suffered most. Chilled to the bone, they were prone to coughs that grew deep and stubborn. The cold air, thick with smoke, choked their little lungs. Fevers came quickly, so did weakness. Parents watched helplessly, knowing they had no herbs, no healer, only warmth and hope to give. And yet, they endured, because every night survived was a victory, and every morning, no matter how pale or bitter, was a mercy. The cottages themselves creaked and whispered with the wind. Rats scurried in the thatch. Ice formed inside the wooden water pails. And yet, in the circle around that fire, a kind of peace could still be found. They did not complain, not in the way we might imagine. There were no comparisons to what others had, because nearly everyone in the village lived the same way. Instead, there was acceptance, a grim wisdom passed down through winters long past. Keep the fire alive, keep the family close, and wait. Wait for the thaw, wait for the sun, wait for the miracle of green returning to the fields. But such miracles were far off still, and so they added another twig to the flame, pulled the blankets tighter, and leaned into one another as the wind howled. Beyond the shuttered window, their shelter was not much, but in winter, it was everything. Winter in the medieval world was not merely a season, it was a recalibration of time itself. As the days shortened and the nights grew longer, the very shape of existence shifted. The sun, once a constant companion through field and forest, now rose reluctantly, casting pale light across the frostbitten land, and vanished again before the day had even matured. In some places, the light lasted no more than 8 hours, barely enough for work, and not nearly enough for warmth. People adapted, not with resistance but with resignation. They rose later, slept earlier. The rhythm of life grew slower, softer, subdued. Without clocks or watches to bind them to fixed hours, time flowed more like a stream under ice. Subtle, muffled, but ever present. Work in the fields all but ceased. The soil was frozen, the crops long gone. Even the trees offered no fruit, only the occasional fallen branch or patch of bark, useful for mending roofs or kindling fires. In the absence of agricultural labour, daily life turned inward. Inside the cottage, inside the self, there was weaving to be done, or mending. Wool spun slowly between cold fingers, leather softened and sewn, ropes braided from dried grass. But even these tasks were limited by the cold, by the light, by the bone-deep fatigue that seemed to come not from exertion, but from the very weight of winter. People slept more during these months, not in long, luxurious rests, but in broken stretches, curled beneath layers of coarse linen and straw. In many places, segmented sleep was common. One would drift off soon after darkness fell, rise briefly in the dead of night, perhaps to tend a fire, whisper a prayer, or sit in stillness, and then return to sleep until the weak light of dawn. In this pattern, time dissolved. Nights stretched endlessly. Days passed unnoticed. The mind, like the body, moved more slowly in winter. There was space for memory, for contemplation. An old woman might sit by the hearth, staring into the coals, remembering a springtime from 30 years ago when she wore a garland of violets. A father might cradle his son, whispering half-remembered tales of beasts that roamed the northern woods. A child might listen to the ticking sound of the roof dripping melted frost, wondering if that sound too had a story. The long sleep of the land mirrored the long sleep of its people. Animals entered torpor or huddled in their stalls. The trees, stripped of leaf and colour, stood like silent sentinels. Even the rivers seemed to doze, their surfaces glazed with ice, their currents stilled beneath. There was little sense of urgency in winter. Nothing could be rushed. No field could be tilled. No seed would grow. The wise understood this and did not fight it. Instead, they listened. Listened to the wind groaning at the shutters, to the wood popping in the hearth, to the slow breathing of their kin as they slept beside them. Children, restless by nature, found this season difficult. With no open fields to run in, no rivers to chase frogs along, they turned to stories, games, small mischiefs, a carved toy, a length of string, the art of making shadows dance upon the wall. Elders, by contrast, embraced the stillness. To them, winter was a time not merely for waiting, but for passing on knowledge, stories, old songs, skills, warnings. They understood that every winter might be their last, and in the dim corners of the long sleep, they took the time to speak gently, wisely. And what of time itself? The year, once divided so clearly into ploughing, planting, tending, and harvesting, gave way to the vagueness of cold. The church calendar offered structure, Christmastide, Candlemas, Lent on the horizon. But these were markers more spiritual than practical. Each feast day was an anchor in the sea of sameness, a reason to remember light and warmth, if only for a day. There were no clocks in peasant cottages. Time was kept by the sun, and the sun was hidden more often than not. The fire became the only measure, burning down by midnight, built up again before dawn. Some counted the days in sticks of wood burned, in loaves of bread left, in days since the snow first fell. And still, they endured. They did not expect joy, but they knew peace. Peace not as happiness, but as stillness, a form of quiet understanding that all things must sleep, that all green life must retreat, that every tree must bend beneath the snow. And in that surrender, they found rhythm. The long sleep of winter was not a failure of life. It was its pause, its breath between verses. And when one listens to that pause, truly listens, it can sound like a kind of music, slow, subtle, ancient, like the heartbeat of the earth itself covered in frost, waiting for spring. In the shadowed stillness of winter, nothing carried more weight than the question, will the food last? For the medieval peasant, this was not a matter of inconvenience. It was the fulcrum upon which survival turned. A well-fed winter was a rarity, a lean one, the norm. And a famine, a memory not so distant. The table in the cottage was never grand. It was often no more than a plank across two barrels, or a smoothened stump of wood. Upon it sat a few wooden bowls, a cracked ladle, perhaps. A single knife passed between many hands. But in winter, even this humble setup could feel like a banquet hall, or an altar of despair. Each meal began not with a choice, but with a calculation. How many days of oats remained? How far would the salted pork stretch? Were the onions too soft, too rotten to cook? Had the cheese moulded beyond saving? These were the questions whispered in kitchens barely warm, as mothers stared into sacks and pots with furrowed brows. Autumn had given its bounty. Grains were threshed and stored in wooden bins. Turnips and leeks hung in clusters, cool and quiet in root cellars dug deep beneath the earth. Apples, shriveled but edible, rested in straw-lined baskets. If a family had been lucky, there was a wheel of cheese aging on a shelf, or a small pile of salted fish tucked into clay jars. But winter was long, and time was greedy. The first weeks passed gently, with soups rich in onion and carrot, with bread still soft enough to chew. Sometimes there was honey or dried berries saved from summer. But these delights faded quickly. By midwinter, the meals had grown thinner, the bowls lighter. Porridge became a staple, made from barley or rye, stirred until it thickened enough to feed many mouths. It was bland, it was repetitive, but it filled the stomach, and in that it was a treasure. Bread, too, was central. In summer, it was baked fresh with yeast and care. In winter, it was harder, darker, sometimes mixed with husks and ground beans to make it last. The loaves were heavy, sour, and often stale by the time they reached the table. Yet they were chewed slowly, reverently, as if each bite carried the warmth of sunlight remembered. Meat was rare. The pigs slaughtered in late autumn had been preserved, salted, smoked, hung in cool places, but only small pieces were eaten at a time, usually boiled into stew to flavour a larger pot of gruel. A single bone might serve a family for 3 days, scraped, reboiled, reused. And then there were the days when there was simply nothing. No more grain, no more root vegetables, only the frostbitten hope of scavenging. Nettles were gathered from beneath the snow. Bark was scraped and boiled. Moss, if clean, could be softened into an edible mash. Some chewed on leather, softened in water, or made tea from pine needles to quiet the hunger. Famine came not like a storm, but like a whisper. It began in one cottage, someone too proud to beg, too late to ration. A child's cough grew weaker. A man returned from the woods with nothing in his sack. The neighbours shared what they could, but then they too began to look thinner. In years of true scarcity, entire villages fell into hunger together. Children's faces grew hollow. Mothers gave up their portions. Elders faded without complaint. And always, the fear. How much longer, until the thaw? And yet, despite this hardship, there remained moments of grace at the winter table. A handful of dried herbs could lift the flavour of a broth. A bit of garlic tucked away could turn a bland dish fragrant. A neighbour might bring a half loaf to share. On feast days, the community pooled what they had. Eggs saved for weeks, the last apple, a bit of ale, and gathered, cold but smiling, to eat and remember joy. For those who worked in monasteries or on noble estates, winter meals could be less desperate. The monks, in their structured discipline, preserved food carefully, smoking fish, drying pulses, storing wine and ale in thick-walled cellars. The noble larders held more variety, dried fruits, rich breads, salted beef. Yet even in stone halls, the meals of winter lacked the abundance of summer, because winter humbled everyone. It reminded them that the earth was sleeping, and with it, the ease of plenty. It turned food into a ritual, a meditation, a quiet thanksgiving. Even a simple onion stew eaten slowly by the fire became a symbol of resilience. To eat in winter was to hope. To share food was to love. And to go to bed hungry, as many did, was to pray that tomorrow the pot would not be empty. Thus, the bitter cup was passed, hand to hand, year to year. And still, they drank, because it was not bitterness alone. It was survival. It was said among the elders that a good fire could chase away even the most stubborn cold. But in the depths of medieval winter, even the strongest fire bowed before the wind. The hearth, glowing softly in the centre of every home, was not only a source of warmth, it was life itself. Yet keeping that fire alive was no simple matter. Wood was not infinite. Peat, charcoal, and dried dung were precious. Each log burned was a measure of time, of breath, of safety. In late autumn, families had gathered what they could. They ventured into woods near and far, collecting fallen branches, stripping bark, pulling down dead limbs. Children helped too, dragging bundles with frozen fingers, their cheeks red from wind. If the household was lucky, a small pile of seasoned firewood would be stacked near the door by first frost. But winter was long, and the pile shrank quickly. Burning wood was both a necessity and a risk. Burn too little, and the house remained cold. The family shivered, and illness crept in. Burn too much, and the fire would die before winter's end, leaving nothing but cold walls and empty grates. It was a balance few could master, so fires were managed with great care. In the early morning, a parent would rise in the half-dark, hands trembling with cold, to check the embers. If they glowed faintly, they were gently stirred, fed with kindling, coaxed back into life. If the fire had died completely, the task grew harder. Flint was struck, sparks were nursed, and breath was blown steadily until flame danced once more. A cold hearth was a heavy burden. It meant no hot food, no warmth to dry damp clothes, no light to soothe the fear of night. In such times, families huddled even closer. Blankets and furs were layered thick. Stones, heated near the fire earlier, might be tucked under bedding, but the cold found them still. It slipped beneath doorways, it poured down chimneys, it crawled across floors of packed earth and touched bare skin with fingers like ice. Fuel was rationed. Good oak or beechwood was prized for its long burn. Pine, though easier to find, burned quickly and threw sparks. Peat, dug from marshy ground and dried into bricks, offered a steady if smoky flame. In some homes, dried animal dung, carefully shaped and stored, served as the only fuel. It burned hot, but left a scent that clung to everything, and always the fire was guarded. Children were taught to watch it carefully. A falling ember could set straw bedding alight. A gust of wind through a crack in the wall could snuff it out. Fire was friend and foe alike, a blessing wrapped in danger. In larger homes, such as those of the minor nobility, multiple hearths existed, one in the great hall, others in kitchens and chambers. Servants were assigned to tend these, feeding logs steadily, sweeping ash, keeping the flames alive for the lords and ladies wrapped in fur-lined cloaks. But even in those halls, there were cold corners. Stone walls, no matter how thick, grew damp. Tapestries offered some insulation, but the wind found its way in. Rooms unused were left unheated, their chill seeping into adjacent spaces. Guests were advised to sleep with hats, and basins of water froze overnight, even beside the bed. In monasteries, the cold was accepted with spiritual discipline. Monks rose before dawn to chant in stone cloisters where breath hung like incense. Fires were allowed only in the kitchen and infirmary. Elsewhere, silence and stillness reigned. The chill was not only endured, it was seen as a form of devotion. To suffer cold in this life was to warm the soul for the next. But for the peasant, cold was no sacred trial. It was an ever-present enemy. To keep warm, they worked constantly. Even in winter, someone was always mending, stitching, cleaning, moving. Sitting still for long meant letting the cold take hold. Even the old, who could barely walk, found small tasks to keep their blood moving. Sorting wool, shelling peas, telling stories that made others smile. And still, the cold won small battles. Fingers cracked and bled. Toes grew numb. Ears turned. Red, then white, then blue. Frostbite was not a known word, but it was a known pain, a known silence. When someone went out to fetch water and did not return, or when a child's skin would not warm, the family understood. The fire had not been enough, and yet the flames continued. They burned not only for heat, but for hope. The flicker of orange against stone, the scent of burning birch or heather. It reminded the family that life continued, however fragile. That morning might still come, and with it, a softer wind. At night, when the fire dimmed, the family whispered prayers, not only for the soul, but for the fire itself, that it might last, that it might glow just a little longer, that the night would pass without the world turning to ice. And so the struggle against the cold was waged, not with loud defiance, but with quiet endurance, one ember at a time. Long before down-filled coats and thermal undergarments, warmth came from cloth and from wisdom. In the medieval winter, when fires flickered low and cold clung to the corners of every dwelling, people wrapped themselves not only in garments, but in tradition. Clothing became armor against the season, layered and patched, mended and shared. until it resembled a second skin, rough but essential. Wool was the treasure of winter. It was spun from the fleece of sheep that had grazed in summer meadows, now huddled in barns or led to sheltered fields. The wool, thick and slightly oily with natural lanolin, held heat even when damp. Coarse in texture, it was often worn unlined by the poor, who could not afford linen underlayers. But it was warm, and in winter that was all that mattered. A peasant might wear 2 or 3 tunics, one over the other. The outermost was often the oldest, stained, patched, and wind-worn. Beneath that, a thicker layer. Under all, if they had one, a linen shift to soften the scratch of wool. Trousers were likewise layered when possible, with wool wrappings bound around the calves and feet to fend off frost. Footwear was rudimentary. Simple leather boots or shoes, worn year-round, were stuffed in winter with straw, moss, or scraps of cloth. This made walking cumbersome, but walking was not done for comfort. It was done for survival. Bare feet were rare in winter, even for children, but thin soles meant every step echoed with the cold of the earth beneath. For warmth at night, families wrapped themselves in everything they had. Woolen cloaks served as blankets. Old furs were laid across sleeping areas. Straw, changed periodically, was piled high in shared beds to trap heat. Those without enough cloth-layered bodies instead, sleeping tightly pressed, sharing breath beneath a single covering. Furs, when available, were prized beyond words. Fox, hare, or even squirrel pelts were sewn into collars or worn as liners. The wealthy might drape themselves in sable or ermine, symbols of status as well as insulation. But even a rough sheepskin, worn across the shoulders or tucked inside a coat, made a world of difference. Head coverings were essential. Much of a body's heat escaped from the scalp. Women wore coifs or veils, sometimes layered beneath hoods. Men donned woolen caps, tightly knit or sewn from scraps. Children often slept in theirs. In some households, people went to bed fully dressed, caps and all, their breath rising like smoke in the icy air. And still, it was never quite enough. Cold found its way in, not just physically, but emotionally. The weight of constant chill wore on the spirit. It made tempers short, silences longer. It slowed fingers at their work, dulled laughter into murmurs. But people adapted. They found ways to make warmth last a little longer. Clothing was dried near the fire, not too close, lest it burn. Cloaks hung on pegs beside the hearth, trousers draped over stools, shoes placed with care to thaw without cracking. The smell of damp wool was ever present, mingling with smoke and the scent of stew. Mending was constant. A tear in a tunic could be a disaster if left unrepaired. A hole in a sock could mean frostbite by morning. So mothers and grandmothers kept their needles close, threading coarse yarn through cloth again and again. The quiet rhythm of stitching a kind of meditation. The communal nature of warmth cannot be overstated. In households with little, sharing was essential. A child might borrow a parent's cloak. Siblings might share boots on alternating days. A grandmother might pass down a shawl she'd worn for 40 winters. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was owned entirely. Even emotion played its part. A shared song, a quiet tale, the simple act of sitting close, all helped fend off the deeper cold. Not the cold of air, but the cold of loneliness. In these small, unspoken gestures, warmth passed from soul to soul, and beyond the cottages, clothing took on even greater significance. Travellers wrapped themselves in layers before venturing out. Cloaks, clasped tightly, scarves wound around their faces, hands buried in woolen sleeves. Merchants carried spare socks in their packs. Priests wore heavy robes, often lined with fur in winter. Knights donned padded gambesons beneath their armour, not only for protection, but for insulation. But for the peasant, it was always a question of enough. Enough thread to sew, enough wool to spin, enough layers to feel one's fingers in the morning. And when those were not enough, they turned to each other. Because in the end, Warmth was not just a matter of cloth and skin. It was a matter of kinship, of shared blankets, shared meals, shared hope, of knowing that as the snow fell beyond the shuttered window, there were hands to hold, stories to tell, and bodies to curl beside in the long, long night. And so, wrapped in wool, wrapped in one another, they waited. Not for the end of cold, but for the first green sign of spring. Winter did not knock when it entered a home. It crept in, silent and cold, curling around the bones and nestling in the lungs. And with it came illness. In the medieval world, sickness was not a rare visitor. It was a familiar presence, made crueler by the hush of snow and the stillness of ice. The cold slowed the body, hunger weakened it, and in that perfect stillness, disease found its home. Coughs were everywhere. They echoed through cottages and halls, dry and rasping, or wet and choking. At first, they were dismissed, a product of smoke or the morning frost. But when the cough deepened and the face grew pale and the child no longer played, then fear settled in. There were no doctors in most villages. Healers, yes, women, with knowledge passed through generations, who knew which roots might soothe a fever, which teas might calm a belly, but they had no herbs in winter. The earth was asleep, and with it, her gifts. What remained were dried remnants, mint, elderflower, perhaps a bit of horehound or thyme. Not always enough. Fever was feared above all. It came quickly, turning skin hot and cheeks red, even in the bitterest cold. It stole appetite, then speech, then breath. Parents watched helplessly as their child burned beneath woolen blankets, eyes glassy, lips cracked. They sang to them softly. They placed cold cloths on their brow. They prayed. Some recovered. Others did not. And the silence that followed was heavier than snow. Adults, too, succumbed. The old especially, those whose bones ached before winter even began. A single fall on frozen ground could spell the end. A single night without warmth. A single cough that deepened too quickly. Cold weather did not cause disease, they said, but it welcomed it. Pneumonia, though unnamed, was known. So too was dysentery, worsened by frozen water buckets and poor sanitation. The communal life of the peasant cottage meant illness spread swiftly. One child sick became 5, and then a mother, then the grandfather. The beds grew crowded with the unwell. Outside help was rare. Priests came to offer last rites sometimes. They knelt beside low beds, their breath visible in the frigid air, offering words of comfort in Latin few understood, but many felt. In monasteries, infirmaries offered better shelter, but only for the few. There, monks tended the ill in silence, cloaked in wool and duty. Death in winter felt different. It was not marked by thunder or storm, but by a slow fading, a weakening of breath, a quiet stillness. The body did not rot quickly in the cold. It lay in eerie peace, as if only asleep. Burials were delayed, sometimes by frozen ground. The dead were kept inside, wrapped in linen, surrounded by candlelight and whispered prayer. Grief, too, was muted. There were no loud wails, no black garments, only quiet mourning, the absence of a voice, the weight of one less body by the fire. And yet, life continued, because it had to. Survivors tended the sick, buried the lost, and rose the next day to stoke the fire again. There was no time for despair. Bread still needed baking, wood still needed gathering, the living still needed warmth. Children learned early that death was part of winter. They did not fear it with the sharpness we might expect. Rather, they carried it like a memory, soft, worn, always present. A sibling buried last year, a grandmother whose shawl they now wore. Each winter wrote new names into the silence, and each spring, life resumed with fewer voices. Faith was both comfort and question. Why did God take the young? Why did the healthy fall, while the frail endured? These questions lingered like frost, never fully melted. Yet faith endured, as necessary as fire. It gave shape to suffering. It offered the promise of something warmer, brighter, beyond. Still, in those long nights, the fear remained. A sudden chill, a persistent cough, a child refusing food. These were omens, and the family, bound together by shared breath and shared blankets, waited, not just for healing, but for time to pass, for death to spare them one more year, for spring to come, and with it, the easing of illness. Hope, fragile though it was, never fully vanished. A tea that soothed a cough, a song that eased a child's sleep, a story whispered by firelight to calm the trembling heart. These small acts of love, repeated across centuries, were acts of resistance against the cold, against death, against forgetting. And so they lived, even as others did not, because to endure was to remember, and to remember was to survive. When a soul passed in winter, the world did not mourn with colour. It mourned with silence. In spring, a funeral might have meant flowers. In summer, soft ground and warm sun. But in winter, death arrived in a world already hushed, already dim. Snow fell like ash. The wind keened through bare trees. The earth itself, frozen solid, resisted the hand of the gravedigger. The body was prepared with care. Even among the poorest, there was a reverence for the dead. The hands were folded. The eyes, if open, were gently closed. A linen shroud was wrapped around the limbs, sometimes white, sometimes off-grey with wear. If there was coin, it might be placed near the head or tucked into the palm. For the wealthier, a wooden coffin was constructed. For most, a simple bier of branches would suffice, but winter complicated every gesture. Water had to be heated to wash the body. The linen, stiff with frost, needed thawing before it could wrap the limbs. If the body was to lie in state, it did so in a room no warmer than the air outside. The cold preserved the flesh, yes, but it also made it harder to touch, to dress, to weep over. And then there was the earth. Digging a grave in frozen ground required strength and time. Picks and iron spades were used to break through layers of frost. Sometimes the work was done in shifts. 2 men digging, 2 resting. Breath, steaming, hands blistered. If the ground was too hard, the burial was delayed. The body kept in a barn or church, watched over with candles, until the soil softened enough to open. The funeral was quiet. The bells rang low, their sound muffled by snow. Not all could attend. Travel was difficult, and the cold too harsh for the frail. But those who came walked slowly, bundled in wool, scarves drawn high, boots crunching across the white path to the churchyard. There, the priest waited. In his hand, a book of prayers. On his shoulders, a cloak lined with fur against the wind. His words were solemn, spoken through misted breath. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. And all around, the world gave no reply. Only the creak of trees, the whisper of the cold. The body was lowered carefully. If there was a coffin, ropes helped guide it. If only a shroud, then 2 or 3 men bore it down by hand, resting it gently in the hole. Earth, if not too frozen, was then shoveled back, slowly, reverently, each clump, falling with a thud that echoed through the still air. Sometimes no marker was placed. Sometimes only a wooden cross. Stone was too costly and time too short. The memory lived not in monuments, but in mouths, in the quiet ways a name was spoken, or not spoken, around the fire. Children asked fewer questions in winter. They knew, in their way, that death was closer then. They had seen the empty chair, felt the colder bed, heard the silence that followed a final cough. They watched the rituals with wide, unblinking eyes, not with fear, but with understanding. For the living, grief came quietly. There was no room for great displays. Tears froze quickly on the cheek. Long mourning was delayed by the need to survive. The mother still had to stir the pot. The father still had to mend the roof. The wood still had to be chopped. And so grief sank deep below the frost line, stored like roots waiting for spring. In monasteries, death was marked with bell and chant. The brothers carried the dead in procession, their voices rising in sacred rhythm. The names were entered into records, prayers assigned, candles lit for the soul's journey. In this, there was peace, a sense of order, a belief that even in death there was divine purpose. In noble homes, the rituals were grander. Black drapery hung from rafters. Masses were said. Lands might be given to the church in exchange for prayers, but even here, the cold intruded. Mourners shivered in stone chapels. The scent of incense mingled with the scent of smoke and damp, and the grief, though cloaked in velvet, was no less sharp. Winter reminded everyone of limits, of bodies that could not last, of breath that could not be held forever, of names that, no matter how beloved, would one day fade into the snow. Yet still, they honoured the dead. Not with extravagance, but with steadiness. A candle lit each night, a prayer whispered before sleep, a loaf of bread left on the windowsill, for a soul's safe passage. A story told to a child who never knew the one they'd lost. In these quiet acts, remembrance lived, and through remembrance, so did love, even in winter, especially in winter. In the heart of winter, when breath hung thick in the still air, and the sun gave only a pale suggestion of day, people turned to something deeper than warmth. They turned to light, not from the hearth, but from the heavens. Faith, in the medieval world, was not a garment one wore lightly. It was woven into life as tightly as wool on the spindle. And in winter, when the world itself seemed paused in mourning, faith became not just guidance, but refuge. The church stood tall even as the cottages sagged beneath snow. Built of stone and shadow, it loomed at the centre of every village like a quiet guardian. Inside, the air was colder than out, but holier somehow. The flickering of candles, the scent of beeswax and incense gave comfort. The walls echoed with old hymns, voices rising not from joy, but from need. Mass was still held, even in the deepest cold. On Sundays, villagers trudged through snow, scarves tight around their faces, boots heavy with frost. They came not for spectacle, but for the steady rhythm of words they had heard since childhood. Credo in unum Deum. I believe in one God. And with that belief came courage. The calendar of the church was especially precious in winter. Each feast day was a star in the darkness, a reason to mark time, to gather, to hope. Chief among these was Christmas. Unlike the lavish celebrations of later centuries, the medieval Christmas was quiet, reverent, and steeped in symbolism. The day began with a midnight mass, long, candle-lit, the cold sharp against the skin, even, within stone walls. Hymns were sung with cracked voices. The Nativity was retold in gentle words. The Christ child, born into poverty, gave meaning to the poverty of the faithful. Afterward, there might be bread dipped in honey. A small gift, perhaps an apple, a carved token, a sprig of evergreen placed in the rafters. Not wealth, not splendour, just warmth shared and a story of divine love told again and again. The 12 days of Christmas offered a rare season of joy, feasting when possible, song when spirits allowed. Neighbours visited one another, sharing bits of food, lighting candles, exchanging blessings. The harshness of winter was softened by these moments, brief but luminous. Even in the poorest homes, a candle burned brighter, and the laughter of children rang a little clearer. Other festivals dotted the winter months, each aflame against the dark. St. Lucy's Day, in some lands, honored light in the longest night. Girls, wearing crowns of candles, walking solemnly through churches and halls. Candlemas, in early February, marked the presentation of Jesus at the temple, but also symbolized purification, a farewell to darkness. And in between these days of ritual, prayer filled the silence. The rosary was murmured by the hearth. Psalms were chanted in monasteries, their words echoing off frozen stone. Icons and crucifixes were kissed, touched with trembling fingers, as if they alone held the promise of spring. But faith was not only formal, it lived in every gesture of care, in the sharing of bread, in the lighting of a candle for the sick, in the placing of a hand on a neighbor's shoulder, even in the telling of old tales, of saints who healed with a touch, of angels who warmed the shepherd's fire, of Mary wrapping the child Jesus in swaddling cloth as soft as lamb's wool. These stories were not merely told, they were lived, because they gave people a language for suffering, a way to name their pain and a reason to endure it. If the saints had starved and still sung, then perhaps one more hungry night could be survived. If Christ had been born in a stable, then their own barns, cold and rough, were not forgotten places. The church itself offered shelter for some. The poor, the orphaned, the widowed, those with no fire of their own, were sometimes given a corner near the chapel hearth. There they warmed themselves in silence, wrapped in borrowed cloaks, heads bowed not in shame, but in prayer. And always there was the candle. It became more than wax and flame. It was symbol and sacrament. The candle was lit at birth, at marriage, at death. In winter, it was the soul itself, fragile, flickering, and yet unextinguished. In the deep night, when the wind rattled the shutters and the fire burned low, the candle remained. Its light trembled, but it remained, and so did they. Because in faith, they found warmth no frost could steal. In festivals, they found memory and song. And in sacred light, they found the will to wait. One more night, one more week, one more season, until the snow melted, until the bells rang again, not for mourning, but for resurrection. In the stillness of a medieval winter, where fields slept beneath snow and rivers whispered beneath ice, the work of women did not pause. It deepened. While the earth lay dormant and the plough rested beside the barn, the cottage remained alive, kept, breathing by the hands of women who stirred, mended, and watched over everything with quiet endurance. Their labour, though often unseen, was the hearthstone of winter survival. A woman's day began before the light. Long before the rooster crowed, she would rise in the cold, the floor beneath her feet unforgiving. Her breath fogged the dark air as she reached for her shawl, for her wooden spoon, for the pot to set over last night's embers. If she was lucky, there were still coals glowing in the hearth. If not, she knelt to coax the fire back to life, her fingers red and trembling. Water had to be fetched, even in snow. From the nearest stream or well, sometimes far, sometimes frozen over, she would break the ice with a stick, fill the bucket, and carry it back with stiff arms. The path was slippery, the wind sharp, yet she walked it daily. Then came the food. She stirred the morning porridge, adding what little flavour she could. Onion, herbs, a bit of milk if the goat had given enough. Bread, if any remained, was sliced thin. Each portion measured with precision born not of calculation, but of care. She served her family first. Often, she ate last, or not at all. When breakfast was done, the house did not rest. Clothing had to be repaired. Woolen socks, stretched thin, were darned with coarse yarn. Cloaks were patched at the elbow, tunics rehemmed where they had frayed. Linen was boiled, scrubbed, beaten against cold stones. The work was slow and always cold. Water chilled her hands to numbness, but she pressed on. Spinning was one of her constant tasks. With the drop spindle or the great wheel, she turned fleece into thread. her fingers moving in rhythm, her thoughts drifting. Sometimes she hummed, sometimes she sang softly to a child sitting nearby. The thread wound tighter, stronger, a promise of cloth to come. Weaving, too, filled the winter hours. If the family had a loom, it stood in a corner, its wood smooth from use. Wool was passed through warp and weft, building layer by layer the fabric for future tunics, blankets, and hope. This was work that outlasted the season. It clothed generations. She also made candles. Tallow was melted slowly over the hearth, then poured and shaped with steady hands. Each candle was a measure of light for dark evenings, each one a little, flame against the long night. She made them for her family, for the church, for trade if there was surplus. The children never left her side. Too young to wander outside in winter, they played at her feet, clutched her skirts, asked endless questions. She answered them while peeling turnips, while stirring stew, while spinning thread. Her lap was their shelter, her voice their lullaby. She taught them too. Without books, without parchment, she passed on knowledge, how to mend a tear, how to fold a blanket, how to dry herbs, how to pray. The learning was soft and constant, like falling snow, one layer atop another, until the child became part of the rhythm. And when someone fell ill, it was she who tended them. She wiped brows, she held cold hands, she whispered comfort in the dark. Her own rest was forgotten. Sleep came only in fragments, between the cries of the sick and the stirring of the fire. For those with livestock, she did even more. She fed the chickens, milked the goat, scattered straw in the barn. She checked on birthing ewes in the night, wrapped newborn animals in rags, fed them with spoons when mothers refused. Her care extended beyond her kin. It reached every creature under her roof. She prayed, too, often alone, kneeling on straw, hands clasped, whispering for strength. Not grand prayers, just small, steady ones. For warmth, for enough bread, for her husband's cough to ease, for the snow to stop, just for a day. And at night, when the house lay still and the fire burned low, she folded each child beneath a blanket, tucked the corners tight, kissed chilled foreheads and lay down beside them, not in rest, but in watchfulness. Because even sleep was work. To sleep too deeply was to risk not hearing a cry, not feeling the fire fade, not noticing a fever. So she slept lightly, one ear open, one hand always near the baby, one thought always fixed on the dawn. Her labor was unending, yet she was not bitter. There was pride in the rhythm, in the finished blanket, in the mended shoe, in the small face pressed to her breast, warm and breathing. Her work did not make her famous, but it made survival possible. She was the keeper of heat, of cloth, of food, of life itself. In the bitterest months, it was not the fire alone that kept the family alive. It was her. And when spring came, the earth did not bloom more bravely than she did. In the high towers of stone, where banners once fluttered in the summer wind and trumpets rang across green fields, winter came not as a stranger, but as a conqueror. The medieval castle, so imposing in appearance, so firm in defense, was never a refuge from the cold. Its walls, thick and unyielding, trapped the chill as surely as they repelled arrows. The noble lord and his household lived surrounded by grandeur and by draught. Stone does not warm. It holds the cold like a memory, seeping into chamber floors, clinging to arches and vaults, making every step echo in icy silence. The tapestries hung on the walls, great woven histories of lions and saints, did little more than flutter when the wind snuck in through cracks. Yet here lived the lords of winter, wrapped in fur-lined cloaks, seated beside great hearths that devoured entire logs by the hour. They ruled from high-backed chairs while their fingers still tingled with cold. Servants bustled constantly, feeding fires, drawing heavy curtains, placing warmed stones beneath, bedding, But no comfort lasted long. A nobleman's duties did not pause in winter. Even as snow filled the courtyards and the drawbridge creaked under frost, matters of estate persisted. Rents were collected, disputes settled, supplies counted. Letters arrived by frozen hands, sealed in wax that cracked from the cold. Messengers were cloaked from head to heel, faces hidden, speech stiff with windburn. Feasting remained, but it changed. The great hall, once filled with roasted meats and bright music in summer, now felt cavernous and echoing. Meals were served on cold plates, the heat lost before it reached the tongue. Ale froze in the cup if held too long. Servants hovered nearby with cloths and coals, ready to revive warmth where they could. Still, the noble families made efforts to keep spirits alive. Musicians played lutes and harps, fingers stiff on strings. Minstrels told tales of fire-breathing beasts and enchanted woods. Children played with carved wooden animals near the hearth, their laughter rising briefly above the crackle of logs. Sometimes there was dancing, slow, ritualistic, more for movement than mirth. In the upper chambers, the ladies of the house kept their own rhythms. Their hands were never idle, embroidery, mending, the copying of psalms in delicate ink. They visited the sick in the infirmary, oversaw the kitchens, taught younger girls the ways of the household. In winter, their roles grew heavier, as they too ensured warmth and order through the long months of waiting. Even within walls of power, illness found its way. Colds spread from servant to squire. Fevers came without cause. Death, though less frequent than among the poor, was still a guest no gate could bar. The chaplain was kept busy with prayers, the infirmary filled with herbs and tinctures. A noble's life might be longer, but not always stronger. Winter bred reflection. The nights were long, and with them came thoughts. A lord might walk alone on the battlements, breath rising like mist, eyes cast over the snowbound lands below. He saw no green fields, no labourers at work, only a white silence that matched the quiet in his halls. He thought of the wars fought in warmer seasons, of treaties signed, of sons gone to squire in far-off castles. He felt perhaps a strange kinship with the earth, resting, waiting, preparing. His sword, polished and hung above the hearth, gleamed with frost rather than blood, for now. There were councils in winter too. Noble guests from nearby manors arrived by sleigh or horseback, their furs thick, their entourages shivering. They brought news, gifts, sometimes potential matches for marriage. In the candle-lit grate, Hall's plans were whispered over maps and goblets, the future drawn out in cautious lines. But there was also loneliness. A castle could be crowded and still feel empty. The echoes of past banquets, the absence of music, the distant cry of a wolf. Beyond the walls, these lingered. The nobleman, seated before his fire, surrounded by wealth, felt the weight of the season not just on his shoulders, but in his heart. He was the winter lord, but even he could not command the sun to rise sooner, or the snow to melt. So he did, as his peasants did. He endured. He wore his cloak tighter. He moved from fire to fire. He watched over his household. He gave alms to the poor. He prayed. And in the quiet hours, when the halls were asleep and only the hearth remained, he would gaze into the flames and see not only his power, but his place within a world much older, colder, and greater than himself. The stone castle held, firm, but it was the warmth of the people within that kept it alive. The snow came softly at first, brushing the rooftops with a gentle hand, dusting the thatch like flour on bread. Then it thickened, blanketing the fields, muffling the world until the village stood silent beneath the grey sky, like a painting left unfinished by the wind. No bells rang, no carts creaked. Even the birds, those last stubborn creatures that hadn't fled, grew quiet, perched in the bare limbs of trees, their feathers puffed for warmth, their songs swallowed by the hush. A medieval village in the heart of winter, was not dead. It was dreaming. Its breath moved slowly, smoke from chimneys curling like soft fingers into the still air, rising straight toward the heavens in the absence of wind. Footprints, quickly blurred by flurries, marked the paths between cottages. Life continued, but in a whisper. The cottages were close set, like sheep huddled for warmth. Their walls leaned slightly, their beams groaned under the weight of snow. Small windows glowed faintly from within, amber dots in a landscape of white. Inside, families gathered, murmuring, eating, waiting. Beyond the homes, the land stretched wide and blank. The fields, once checkerboards of colour and labour, lay smooth and untouched. The plough was buried beneath a sheet of frost. Fences slumped under snowdrifts. The river, visible through the bare willows, was slowed, its surface hardened, its voice quiet. Only the children defied the stillness. Bundled in oversized cloaks, wrapped in scarves twice their length, they ventured out in bursts, laughing, chasing one another across the drifts, hurling clumps of snow with mittened hands. Their cheeks were red, their noses running, but their joy warmed the air like sunlight. Through cloud, the adults watched from doorways. They remembered their own youth when snow was magic, not labour. But now, each flake meant more work, more sweeping, more breaking of ice, more hauling of firewood. Still, they smiled, if faintly, at the games. In the children's play, they saw the promise of spring. Work did not cease entirely. Men gathered to clear paths between homes, their shovels scraping rhythmically. Women walked carefully to the well, heads bowed against the cold, buckets swinging at their sides. The blacksmith's forge, though smaller in fire, still glowed. And in the stable, animals lowed and shifted, grateful for any hand that brought feed or fresh straw. But the pace was slower. Time seemed to stretch, unbound by harvests or sowing. The village moved in small rituals, lighting candles at dusk, reciting prayers at dawn, sharing stews, patching clothes, telling stories. Every hour was both quiet and full. Evenings brought the village closer. Neighbours visited one another with caution, slipping across icy paths with care, knocking on wooden doors with mittened hands. Within, they shared food, news, songs. A bit of cider warmed over the hearth. A tale told twice before, but always welcome again. Gossip, laughter, even grief, all woven together in the thick air of the room, and through it all, the snow continued. It fell not in storms, but in steady hushes, fine as flour, soft as wool. It softened the sounds of the world. A dog's bark seemed distant. The chopping of wood echoed gently. Even speech lowered, as though the sky itself were listening. There was a peace to this quiet, not the peace of ease, but of endurance. The villagers did not long for the sun, not yet. They accepted winter as part of the cycle, as necessary as night before morning. They did not curse the snow, they swept it. They did not dread the cold, they worked with it. In this, there was a deep, old wisdom. Resist too much, and you break, bend, and you survive. The church stood at the heart of the village. Its steeple rose above the rooftops like a shepherd's crook. Snow clung to its cross. Inside, it was no warmer than the homes, but it offered solace of another kind. People came to sit, to sing, to listen. The priest spoke softly, his breath rising in clouds, his hands warm from holding the scriptures. He knew every face. He had buried their parents, baptized their children, married them beneath the old stone arch. In winter, his voice carried further, not louder, but clearer. And his words were not of fire or judgment, but of patience, of light returning. The village listened, and when they stepped back into the snow, they did so with steadier hearts. There were no roads to other towns, not now. The world was bounded by white fields and silent trees. But within that small ring of smoke and straw, there was life. There there was warmth. There was waiting. They waited not for miracles, but for thaw, for the sound of water running again, for birdsong returning to the hedges, for the first bud on the blackthorn branch. And until then, they lived one day at a time, beneath snow that fell, without sound, in a village that slept with open eyes. Together, as the snow deepened and the wind sharpened its claws, the medieval imagination stirred. For in the long dark of winter, it was not always the cold that chilled the spine, it was what might lie within it. The world grew quieter in December, and, in that hush, the old stories returned, not the ones of saints and salvation, but of shadows. Tales whispered between sips of warm broth, exchanged between travellers at roadside inns, passed from grandmother to child like a candle held low. Wolves, above all, haunted the mind. To live near forest or moor was to live with the knowledge that wolves roamed freely once the sun fell. In summer, they kept to deeper woods, wary of men and fire. But in winter, when hunger ruled, they drew closer. There were stories, some true, others stretched with fear, of wolves seen pacing the edge of a field, of eyes glowing by moonlight, of footprints found just outside a barn. The wolf was not merely beast, but symbol. To many, it stood for winter itself, relentless, cold, hungry. Its howl was a song of desperation, echoing through valleys, curling beneath shutters. Children were taught to stay inside after dusk, not merely for frost, but for what walked on four legs, and sometimes, in darker tales, on two. For there were other fears. Spirits, they said, moved more freely in winter, when the land lay dormant, and the veil between worlds thinned. The dead walked among the living, not to harm, but to remind. It was common to leave bread on the sill, or a bowl of milk by the hearth, as offering for those who came silently in the night. Ancestors, lost children, old saints. To honour them was to keep them gentle. But not all spirits were kind. Some tales warned of the Yule White, a pale figure in tattered robes, who crept through villages in the coldest weeks, marking the doors of the lazy or the cruel. Others spoke of the snow singer, a woman of ice whose voice drew travellers off the road and into drifts they never escaped. Her song, they whispered, was beautiful, but fatal. The forest, too, was feared. In summer, it was a place of bounty. Mushrooms, berries, wood for the fire. In winter, it became a realm apart. Trees creaked like old bones. Paths vanished beneath snow. A man could walk into those woods at noon and be lost before dusk. Some claimed to have seen lights there, blue flames dancing between trunks, or figures too tall, too still to be human. To name them was to invite them. So instead, people spoke in riddles. They knocked 3 times before entering a barn to ward off what might be waiting. They turned bread crusts upward so no ill luck would settle. They burned herbs on midwinter's eve, juniper, ash, sometimes thyme, to cleanse the air. Superstition, perhaps, but also comfort. For in a world where sickness struck without warning, where snow blocked roads and wolves howled from dark hills, stories gave shape to fear. They offered explanation, protection, tradition, and in sharing them, the villagers drew closer. Winter was a time of telling. Beside the hearth, grandparents told of frost giants and talking stags, of stars that fell and turned to silver coins. Children sat wide-eyed, clutching each other. They listened not for truth, but for tone, for the rise and fall of a voice that promised safety within its sound. Even adults listened, for they too remembered. A story from their childhood. A shadow once glimpsed in a snow-covered lane. A howl that did not sound like a wolf, and so on certain nights they placed extra wood on the fire. They whispered blessings. They paused at crossroads and avoided mirrors after dark. Some fears were real, the fear of becoming lost in snow, of fire dying in the night, of a roof collapsing under heavy ice. These were not tales, they were truths. And yet, even these truths were wrapped in ritual, in rhyme. in the rhythm of ancient caution. Because to fear was human, and to name fear, to wrap it in story, was to tame it, if only a little. So winter was not only a season of hardship, but of remembrance, of the old ways, the old warnings, the old voices. The villagers honored them not because they believed every word, but because to forget them was to forget who they were. And perhaps, somewhere in the deep snow and deeper night, something did listen. Something moved between the trees. Something watched from beneath the hills. But as long as the fire burned and the stories were told, the people endured. Together, wrapped not only in wool, but in wonder. Winter, with all its silence and sorrow, did not come alone. It came with a question whispered in every heart. Will we survive this one? And for many, the answer lay not in one's own fire or loaf of bread, but in the hands of others. In the medieval, village survival was never a solitary act. It was communal, a tapestry woven from hundreds of small kindnesses, passed hand to hand, year to year, generation to generation. Especially in winter, when the world narrowed and hunger grew loud, the people turned to one another. The bread was thinner, yes, it was no longer soft from the oven, but hard at the crust and dry within. It might be mixed with lentils or bean, flour, with last year's husks ground in to stretch the grain. Yet when a knock came at the door, even that modest loaf was broken in two. Neighbours brought soup when they heard coughing through the wall. A bowl of broth, just warm enough, set. On a doorstep, a whisper through the shutter. We had enough for two. Eat it while it's hot. They did not wait for thanks. In truth, they expected none. It was not charity. It was what was done. The same had been done for them. Wood was shared too. The man, with more strength than fuel, might chop an extra bundle for the widow 3 houses down. He would leave it without ceremony beside her door, where the snow had been cleared just enough. If she found it and wept, no one saw. And if she prayed for him. Children were watched communally. With fields empty and work moved indoors, mothers helped one another tend the little ones, trading turns so each could mend a garment or knead dough in peace. The older children carried water, fetched herbs, soothed babies, learned not only from their own kin, but from the entire village. The church, small and cold, became a hub of quiet connection. After Mass, people lingered, not for conversation alone, but for the warmth of presence. Someone might offer a jar of lard, another a wheel of cheese that had kept better than expected. The priest, aware of each need, made gentle suggestions. The Thomases are low on turnips. Might you spare a sack? No one was forced. Yet rarely was there refusal. In winter, generosity was not a virtue. It was a necessity. The line between enough and not enough was thin as the ice on the river. A sick child, a spoiled store of oats, an unexpected snowfall. Anyone could tip a family into danger. And so, they built bridges before the river cracked. They gave while they could, because they knew, next winter, it might be them. Some families, through luck or foresight, fared better. A good harvest in autumn, a strong ox, a warm barn. These made the difference between hardship and hunger. But even these families did not hoard. It was not done. To hoard in winter was to risk not only the soul, but the bonds that held the village together. For what was one family without its neighbours? Who would help mend the roof when the winds came? Who would help bury the dead if they fell? So they shared. They traded too. Not only goods, but skills. The weaver mended cloaks for eggs. The carpenter replaced a broken door in exchange for candles. The healer brought her salve and took in return a pot of lentils and dried sage. Money had little place in winter. Trusted, and there was joy in it sometimes. On feast days, they gathered what they could, dried fruit, a little ale, a pie of onion and herbs, and sat together. They told stories, sang softly, passed bread from hand to hand, watched the snow gather at the windows, and felt for a moment safe. The children laughed loudest. Their voices rose like birds above the weight of the season. They did not fully understand the barter, the sacrifice. They only saw the smiles, the shared bowls, the candles flickering on the table. And so, they grew up believing, rightly, that winter could be beautiful. It was a hard beauty, one built from frost and fire, from loss and resilience. A beauty that did not sparkle, but endured. And at the center of it all was the loaf of bread. No matter how small, it was offered. No matter how stale, it was softened with love. And when it was broken and shared, it fed not only the belly, but the heart. Because to give bread in winter was to say, "We are in this together," and to receive it was to reply, "Yes." And I will do the same when my oven is full again. Thus, the village breathed as one body, beat as one heart. And though the wind howled and the nights stretched long, they endured together. When the last bowl was emptied, the last log tossed upon the hearth, and the final prayer murmured into the hush, winter night took hold. It came early, it came long, and it came softly. No sudden darkness, no drama, just the slow dimming of the sky into shadow and the thickening silence that followed. And in that silence, the medieval mind wandered, not wildly, but with slow steps, like a pilgrim beneath a starless sky. The cottage, once filled with quiet activity, fell into stillness. The fire whispered in low crackles. The wind moaned gently at the eaves, and from the sleeping forms tucked under wool and straw, the occasional sigh or stir punctuated the deep night. But not everyone slept. Some watched. The old woman whose joints ached too deeply for rest. The father who worried over dwindling grain. The mother whose infant stirred, often in the crook of her arm. The monk who rose for night prayers, his breath steaming in the cloister's cold stone corridor. They kept silent watch, not just over others, but over their own thoughts. Night allowed for what day could not. In daylight, the hands were busy, but in darkness, the heart was free to drift. Many thoughts turned toward memory, a spring that seemed impossibly distant, a child long grown or long buried, a day in the field when the sun had been kind, a kiss once given in a hidden corner of the barn. These moments, tucked away through the busy seasons, unfurled in the quiet like scrolls. Some thoughts turned to fear. What if the oats didn't last? What if the baby's cough worsened? What if the snow never stopped? Such questions had no answers, but they demanded attention. And in the quiet, the questions echoed louder than any song. Others dreamed. While still awake, they imagined a better harvest, a kinder winter next year, a miracle, a pig that gives birth early, a relative who brings flour from another village, a sudden thaw. Even those who had little still dreamed, especially those who had little. The nobility watched the night too, in tall, silent chambers. They stood at windows glazed with ice, looking over their lands hidden under snow. They thought of loyalty, of legacy, of heirs yet unproven. They thought of alliances forged by marriage, of lords who might betray, of vassals they had wronged. The night did not spare them. Its silence pressed just as heavily on velvet as on wool, and the monks, cloaked in habit and quiet, felt the night most deeply of all. For them, the darkness was not absence, but presence. It was the time for matins, the first of their sacred offices. They rose while others slept, filed silently into the chapel, and lit their candles one by one. The chanting began low and steady, voices rising like the breath of the earth itself. It was not meant to break the silence, but to give it form. Even the animals felt the weight of night. Cows shifted gently in their stalls, their breath rising in warm puffs. Sheep pressed close together, eyes half-lidded. The barn owl, most awake of all, perched silently, listening not for prayer or thought, but for movement beneath the snow. The stars, when visible, watched without blinking. They pierced the sky. With icy clarity, their distance a reminder of how small even a castle seemed. The moon, when she appeared, turned snow into silver and trees into statues. Her light did not warm, but it comforted. In her glow, paths looked familiar again. Sleep, when it came in layers, not always deep, often broken. The cold stirred the sleeper. The fire needed tending. A dream might rouse the child, and so sleep in winter was more like a tide, ebbing and flowing, drawing back just when one began to settle. And in those waking moments, thoughts returned. Some turned to the divine, others to the dead. Some turned inward, asking quiet questions. Am I good? Have I done right? Will the spring find me still breathing? The night had no answers, but it listened, and for many, that was enough. For the silence of a winter night is not empty. It is full of breath, of memory, of the soul speaking in its own tongue. It is not a punishment. It is a pause, a chance to be still long enough to hear one's own heart, and to remember that even in the deepest cold, something warm still beats inside the chest. And when the rooster finally crowed, and the faint grey of morning crept into the corners of the room, the watchers blinked, stretched, and returned to their tasks. But something of the night remained, a softness in their voice, a stillness in their hands, a glance at the window, as if to say, I remember the stars. Because even as winter tested the body, the long nights shaped the soul. There was a time before the snow fell thick and firm, when roads were paths of promise. Wagons creaked beneath harvests, pilgrims walked with staff and song, traders moved with purpose, and messengers rode like wind over packed earth. But in winter, those same roads froze, hardened into silence, softened into danger. The world grew smaller. For most villagers, winter brought an end to movement beyond their familiar hills. The roads, never truly roads, but rutted paths worn by hooves, and footfall, vanished beneath snowdrifts and ice. Direction lost its meaning when every field looked the same, when the hedgerows were buried and the trees wore white. To step outside the village in winter was to step into the unknown. And few dared it without reason. The cold was not the only threat. Ice made the ground treacherous. Horses, if still strong, could slip and break. Wagons froze in place. Bridges cracked. Streams, once shallow crossings, now lay hidden beneath glass-like crusts that could not hold a child's weight, let alone a cart. But sometimes, travel could not be avoided. A family needed salt from the next hamlet. A message had to reach the manor. A sick child required herbs only found at the monastery across the ridge. Then, a figure cloaked in every rag they owned would vanish into the snow, a bundle on their back, their breath marking the way behind them. Those who travelled in winter became stories. The boy who reached the forest's edge and found a stranger with fire. The merchant whose donkey slipped into a ravine and left him with nothing but prayer. The woman who gave birth on the road, her child wrapped in her own skirt until a stranger passed and helped her home. And sometimes they did not return. Then the village waited. They watched the edge of the path each morning, hoping to see movement through the trees. When none came, they lit candles. They prayed. They listened at night for any sound beyond the wind, because winter did not just freeze roads. It froze connection. Towns became islands. Letters stopped arriving. News from the wider world came only when passed from one traveller to the next, in whispers beside the fire. A death in the next village might not be known for weeks. A birth not celebrated until spring. The isolation changed people. It made them look inward, to their own homes, their own hands, their own thoughts. It made the village tighter, more cautious, more fiercely protective. Every person mattered more. Every absence felt deeper. And yet, The silence of the frozen road also brought peace. No tax collectors arrived. No bandits stirred. No wars spilled over the border. The troubles of the realm seemed paused, just for a season. The nobility, too, stayed, still. Castles became quiet citadels. Lords gave up hunting. Letters were sealed but not sent. Guests were rare, and those who arrived were celebrated like saints, offered wine, fire, stories, and a bed as soft as honor could make it. The monks kept careful records of the weather. They marked days when snow fell without end, when the sun did not appear, when travelers arrived with frostbite or visions of angels in the storm. These notations sat beside scripture, equal in reverence. Because for those who lived by rhythm, the disruption of winter was sacred. Some turned the stillness into spiritual retreat. They fasted, they meditated, they imagined the world beyond the walls, not as lost, but as sleeping, and they waited for the day it would wake. But others found the stillness heavy, especially the young. They longed for market days, for familiar faces returning with stories and goods. They missed the sound of hooves, the laughter of strangers, the rattle of carts on cobbled paths. Winter shrank their world to firelight and shadow. The road, once a ribbon of wonder, became a blank line they were told never to cross. And yet, the longing remained. A glance out the window, a hand on the gatepost, a question whispered in hope. Do you think the snow is melting yet? When the thaw did come, when a single muddy track appeared beneath the white, when a bird cried from the treetop, when hoofprints were found leading from the east, it was as if the world exhaled. The road lived again, and with it, stories returned. A traveller, cloaked in dust and weariness, stepped into the village and brought word of another place, of news, of sorrow, of joy. The people gathered around, eager to listen, not for gossip, but for reconnection. For winter taught them not only to endure, it taught them to value every step taken across a threshold, every letter received, every journey made. And when the roads opened fully and life began to move again, they did not forget the silence. They carried it with them, a quiet respect for stillness, a deepened gratitude for motion. Because when the world grows small, the heart learns to see what truly matters. And when the road calls once more, it is not only a path beneath the feet, it is a promise. In summer, the forest was alive with sound and scent, the rustle of leaves, the murmur of streams, the call of birds overhead. But in winter, the forest became something else entirely. It became a cathedral of silence. The trees stood motionless, bare branches like outstretched fingers reaching toward a sky of pale grey. Their trunks, black and smooth with frost, rose like columns in a great hall no hand had built. Snow clung to every limb. Ice laced the underbrush. And beneath it all, the earth slept. But to those who lived near the wood, the forest never truly slept. It watched. The villagers knew this. Even in winter, they approached its edge with respect, never whistling after dark, never taking more than they needed. They gathered fallen branches, never chopped a living tree without blessing. Some left offerings, a bit of bread, a twist of wool, a prayer murmured under breath, because the forest was old, older than the church, older than the castle. It had seen war and peace, planting and plague. It had grown through the rise and fall of kings. And in winter, when human voices quieted, its voice could be heard again, subtle, slow, but steady. The creak of a limb shifting in the frost, the thud of snow falling from a high branch, the snap of a twig under an unseen foot. To walk among the trees in winter was to walk within another world. Tracks in the snow told stories. Foxes slipping through hollows, deer picking paths to the stream, hares darting between roots. Every mark was a signature, every silence an unwritten line of poetry, and humans left their marks too. Woodcutters entered with axes slung low, scarves tight across their faces. They spoke little, They worked quickly. They knew that to take from the forest was not only labor, but negotiation. A cut tree meant warmth, but also responsibility. Some marked stumps with chalk crosses, others carved runes into bark as thanks. The mae trees themselves were not just fuel, they were symbols. The oak, strong and slow to yield, was a mark of endurance. The holly, evergreen even in deepest snow, symbolized life's persistence. The yew, dark and silent in the graveyard, reminded all that death too was part of the cycle. In stories, the forest held magic. Not always light, not always dark, but deep. It was said that spirits lived beneath roots, that fair folk danced under full moons where the snow never melted, that if you walked too far alone in the trees, the path behind you would vanish, not from snow, but from time. And yet, people went anyway, because the forest gave. It gave wood for fire, bark for mending, berries that clung, somehow, even through frost. It gave shelter to animals that could be trapped, herbs that might be found beneath the snow. And it gave perspective, a vastness that reminded even the proudest soul how small they truly were. Children were taught the names of trees before. They could write their own. They learned which snapped sharply in frost and which bent, which held their leaves, and which whispered in the wind even after shedding. They learned which trees stood near the path home, and which marked the border of what should not be crossed. The monks, too, revered the woods. They walked its edges, in contemplation, quoting psalms that spoke of cedars and fig trees. They compared its silence to divine mystery, its stillness to sacred waiting, and they drew ink from its bark, wrote gospels on its parchment, built altars from its limbs. But the forest could be cruel, a sudden storm, a fallen branch, a child lost chasing a bird. Those who wandered too far, too late, sometimes never returned. There, names were spoken softly, then less often, then only in stories, and the trees kept their secrets. They did not confess, but neither did they forget. In some years, when the snows were deep and the woodpile low, people ventured further in. They took what they needed, but always they looked back. Because the forest had a presence, not human, not animal, but present nonetheless. And so in winter, when the sky was white and the wind had no song, villagers would sometimes stand at the forest's edge, not to enter, but to remember. They would watch the trees sway gently, hear the frost drop in crystal tones, and feel both fear and comfort. Because in a world ruled by seasons, the forest was the one who always remembered. And in winter, it stood not as enemy, nor savior, but as witness, a keeper of silence, a bearer of time, a breathless friend. And though the villagers could not always explain it, they felt it deeply. That the trees knew, that in their roots lay memory, and in their stillness, a promise. Spring will come. Winter was not kind to the small, its cold bit deeper into slender limbs. Its nights stretched longer over sleepless eyes. But to the children of the medieval village, winter was not only a time of hunger and hardship, it was also wonder, wrapped in white, folded in silence, and sprinkled with just enough magic to make the days bearable. Children did not understand fully the fear in their parents' eyes when the stores ran low or the fire dimmed. They knew only that things were quieter, that there was less to eat, and that they must not stray too far from home. But even in hardship, children found play. Snow, for all its danger, became their playground. They built mounds, dug tunnels, rolled balls of packed frost. They chased each other over frozen paths, their laughter piercing the stillness like bells. A stick became a knight's sword, a sled, a noble's carriage, a frozen puddle, a palace of mirrors. They made snow figures, rounded, lumpy, lopsided, and named them after saints or animals. They played games in which snowflakes were blessings, or omens, or fairies fallen from the sky. And when they tumbled, wet and breathless, into the house again, they carried in not only snow on their cloaks, but light in their eyes. Yet their lives were not all play. Even the youngest had tasks. A child of 5 might help feed the chickens, scatter straw in the goat's stall, sweep snow from the threshold with a worn broom. Older ones fetched water, chopped kindling, helped tend the fire when grown hands were busy. Their work was lighter than that of their parents, but not without weight. And when sickness came, it came quickly. A cough in the night, a chill that would not pass. Children were more vulnerable, more often lost. The village had learned to guard them fiercely. Mothers listened closely to their breathing. Fathers bundled them in every scrap of wool they owned. Neighbours brought broth when fevers struck. Still, some did not make it to spring. And the spaces they left behind were never silent again. Yet winter was also when children learned stories. It was the season of long evenings, when work slowed and mouths had more time to speak. They gathered close to the hearth, eyes wide, cheeks flushed from the fire. They listened to tales of brave kings, clever animals, ancient battles, and gentle saints. From their grandmother's lap came lessons wrapped in legend. How the robin got its red breast, why the fox fears the moon, what happens if you whistle after dark. These were not just tales, they were seeds of identity, quietly planted in the soil of memory. Children learned through watching. How their father twisted straw for the roof, how their mother folded dough, humming low, how to stir a pot without spilling, to mend a tear with care, to step softly on creaking floors. Winter taught them patience. It taught them to wait, for the bread to rise, for the fire to catch, for the thaw to come. It taught them silence too, not the silence of fear, but of listening. They learned to hear the world, the pop of the fire, the creak of ice, the way the wind spoke through cracks in the door. They knew how to read the day by the light on the wall, the taste of the air, the mood of the dog. Their games were simple, their toys few. A carved horse, a ball of cloth, a knucklebone used as dice. These were shared, treasured, passed down. They made dolls from rags, crowns from twine, swords from sticks. And in those simple things they built worlds. They played with one another, always near. The fire, always within sight. And when play was done, they curled together to sleep. Siblings beneath one blanket, arms around shoulders, breath rising in a slow shared rhythm. Their dreams were quieter than those of kings. They dreamed of green, fields of sun on their backs, of feasts that never ended, of running barefoot without fear, of lambs born healthy, of songs sung louder. And in the morning, they rose again. Their fingers stiff, their boots cold, but their faces eager. Because each new day, even wrapped in snow, held a chance for play, for learning, for laughter. Children of winter did not know softness, but they knew love. They felt it in every bowl handed to them before their parents ate, in every extra layer draped over their shoulders, in every lullaby hummed over the sound of the storm, and they gave it back in smiles, in songs, in muddy footprints, in mischief that made their elders laugh despite themselves. They were the pulse of the season, quick, light, bright, a reminder that spring would come, that the world, though frozen, was not finished, that life, even in its smallest form, refused to sleep. And so the children of winter played on, beneath the silent snow, beside the crackling fire, within the waiting world. In a season ruled by restraint, of rations measured grain by grain, of warmth held between cupped hands, there remained one tradition that defied the cold with open arms: the winter feast. It did not come often, but when it did, it came like sunlight through cloud, warming more than the body. It warmed memory. It gathered people close, not only to eat, but to remember that they were not merely enduring winter. They were living it. The feast, most often, was timed with the calendar of the church, Christmastide, Epiphany, Candlemas. These holy days were not only marked in scripture, but in stewpots and tablecloths. Even the poorest family found a way to make them different, to set aside a little more, to light one extra candle, to say the blessing with softer voices. A feast was not measured by abundance, it was measured by care. In a modest cottage, the table might hold nothing more than a thicker broth, a fresher loaf, perhaps a scrap of meat long saved. But that was enough, because it came with song, with shared stories, with faces lit by firelight and expectation. In the manorial hall, feasts were larger. The lord of the manor would host not only his household, but the people of the village. On days like Christmas or the feast of St. Stephen, his servants carried trenchers of bread, pots of spiced wine, and joints of roasted meat to the great table. The people sat on benches, shoulder to shoulder, marveling at the bounty. There was formality, yes, but also laughter. For in those moments, the cold was forgotten. The stone walls no longer echoed with silence. Music filled the air. A fiddler played while the children danced near the hearth. The priest offered a prayer. The steward passed the ale, and the Lord, in his fur-lined tunic, lifted a goblet and smiled. The feast was not just for the body, it was for the soul. It reminded all who gathered, we are still here, that despite the frozen fields, the empty trees, the long nights, we have bread, we have voices, we have one another. The preparations began early. Days before, women baked bread and pies, soaking dried apples in wine, mixing herbs into stews. Children were sent to gather kindling. The best crockery was dusted off. Candles, hoarded for such days, were trimmed and readied. The smell alone could stir joy, meat roasting slowly, cinnamon wafting through cracks in the shutters. The sharp scent of wine warmed with clove and orange. Even the fire seemed to burn brighter on feast days, its light catching on copper pots and curious eyes. There were rituals too. In some villages, the eldest woman blessed the bread before it was cut. In others, the youngest child lit the feast candle. Some saved the first slice for a neighbor too frail to attend. Others set a place for the lost, an empty stool, a silent tribute. These gestures were not grand, but they were sacred. They turned a meal into a memory. And after the meal, there was often music. Not professional musicians, but voices. Songs sung 100 times before. Verses added, changed, forgotten, and rediscovered. Refrains that made even the most solemn man tap his foot. Ballads of saints, of love, of foolish animals and clever maids. Sometimes there was dancing. Boots thudded softly on the packed floor. Skirts swirled. Laughter rose, echoed, and settled like warmth on every brow. For a little while, winter itself stepped back, and if one walked past the cottage that night, they might think spring had returned. But the feast did more than bring joy. It also brought memory. The old spoke of winters past, of harsher colds, deeper snows, feasts where only turnips were served, and still they had sung. They reminded the young, this too shall pass. They told of brothers who had left and never returned, of children born in frost who now stirred the stew themselves. In this, the feast became a story, a moment to gather not just food, but family, faith, and remembrance. And when the candles burned low and the last crumb was taken, there was no sadness, only silence, the kind that follows fullness, not of belly alone, but of heart. People rose slowly. They hugged, or nodded, or whispered thanks. They stepped out into the snow with fuller spirits. Their feet crunched softly on the path home, and their breath rose like prayers into the night sky. And in the house, the fire was banked again, the dishes cleaned, the beds made. But something had changed. The cold was still there, yes, but so was the warmth it could never reach, the warmth of bread broken together, of songs shared freely. of one night in the long winter when life itself tasted rich and good. Long before the snow melted, before the mud thickened and the frost retreated from the riverbank, they began to look for signs. Not loudly, not with declarations or excitement, but with quiet watchfulness. The kind of hope that speaks in murmurs and prayers, not shouts. Because in a medieval winter, the line between survival and starvation was thin, and so the people waited, not only with patience, but with ritual. The first sign was often the light, a change so subtle it could go unnoticed by those too busy or weary, but not by the attentive. The sun lingered just a moment longer at the edge of the sky. Its rays, though still cold, carried a hint, just a hint of gold, where before there had been only grey. Someone might notice it while drawing water. Another while tending a lamb, born too soon. The light feels different today, they'd say, and heads would turn skyward, eyes squinting, hearts daring to believe. Then came the snowmelt, not all at once, but in rivulets, thin streams that trickled beneath doorways and ran like veins along the roads. The children watched them, kneeling in the cold, fascinated. The water was still icy, but it moved, and movement, after winter's stillness, was a kind of music. With melt came sound, the drip of icicles falling from eaves, the crack of thawing wood, the soft groan of soil shifting beneath its white coat. And then, one morning, a song, faint, distant, almost imagined. A bird, a robin perhaps, or a lark. Its call rose like incense into the sky, and in that moment, the silence of winter cracked, not completely, but enough to let something green stir beneath the surface of things. The people listened. They did not rush. They did not yet rejoice, because winter had its tricks. It gave false thaws, days of softness followed by nights of biting frost, a week of melt undone by a single snowfall. And so, they moved carefully. They warmed their bones, but kept their coats close. They planted no seed, but cleared the earth with reverence. They marked the signs with old superstitions. If the snow melted from the north side of a tree first, it was said spring would be mild. If the first bird seen was black, it was a year of mourning. If red, a year of birth. If yellow, a year of change. The shape of thawing puddles, the way a dog curled in sleep, the behavior of crows on the barn roof, each held meaning. Not all believed, but all watched, because belief was not always required for reverence. Sometimes, watching itself was the act of faith. In monasteries, the monks took note. They opened narrow windows to catch the scent of the air, still chilled, but tinged now with loam and moss. The herbalist began to prepare her garden, clearing stones, whispering to roots buried deep. In noble halls, the kitchens stirred again, not with feasts, but with plans. How many stores remained, when supplies might arrive, which roads might open first. The steward checked the cellars. The lady of the house called for her seamstress, asking about linen stored away for spring. And in cottages, hope took simpler forms. A door opened wide to let in fresh air. A cloak hung out to dry, not just from damp, but in quiet expectation. Children were the first to believe fully. They stood barefoot on still cold stone, daring the earth to warm them. They dug with sticks in the yard, looking for worms, for signs of life. They pressed their ears to the trunks of trees, hoping to hear sap rising. Some even spoke to the buds forming, barely visible, on the branches above. "I see you," they said, and perhaps the buds heard. The thaw was not only a change of temperature, it was a change of heart. People spoke a little more. They lingered longer at the well. They walked slower, not for caution, but for wonder. They remembered what the world had looked like in green, and they waited for its return, not with desperation, but with gentle trust. They trusted that no winter lasted forever, that beneath every blanket of snow was a seed, asleep, waiting, that each cold breath was one step closer to the season of warmth, and so they watched. They placed stones at the edge of the garden to see if frost returned overnight. They hung bits of fabric from trees to move with the wind and remind the spirit of the forest that people still danced. They told stories again, this time of beginnings. The first flower, the lamb in the field, the Wa'i stream that ran all the way to the sea. The thaw was not here, but it was near, and in that nearness they found strength. Not loud, not boastful, but deep, because after enduring the silence, the snow, the hunger, and the dark, they had earned this sliver of hope, and they would carry it gently, like a spark in cupped hands, until spring made it flame. It did not happen all at once. Spring arrived slowly, not with trumpets or thunder, but with the quiet insistence of life too long held back. A single green shoot, just one, emerged from the foot of the hedgerow. A robin tugged at a worm newly, risen from damp soil. The sun, now gold instead of grey, warmed the edge of the cottage wall where moss had begun to spread. The wind softened, the sky stretched higher, and the people, still cautious, dared to exhale. They opened windows long shuttered. They stepped barefoot into the yard and laughed, not because it was warm, but because it no longer hurt. They pulled chairs outside, to mend clothes in the light, blinking at its brightness. Inside, the ash from the hearth was swept for the first time in months, not only to clean, but to mark the passing. The fire was still lit at night, but it no longer had to roar. Bread rose quicker. Water no longer froze in the bucket. The sound of dripping became a song. In the fields, the thawed soil called gently. Farmers, their limbs still sore from stillness, stepped forward with reverence. They did not rush. They knelt, touched the ground, felt its readiness. Then, with hands long practiced, they tilled. Slow, careful. Each furrow a line of faith drawn into the earth. Children ran ahead of the plough, shouting with joy at worms, at beetles, at the first butterfly trembling past. The sheep, heavy with wool and birth, wandered from the barn and blinked at the wide sky. Chickens scratched new ground, finding insects once hidden beneath frost. The dog, lean from winter, rolled in the mud, barking at nothing but being alive. The season turned not only the land, but the spirit. Faces that had grown thin seemed fuller. Eyes met more often. Voices rose louder, and though food was still rationed, and the grain bins still low, each meal was touched with hope, because they had made it. They had endured. Each bruise, each callus, each scar left by the cold was proof. The old woman who had wept when the roof leaked now laughed when the sun dried her floor. The boy who had been born in deepest frost took his first steps on the thawed threshold, barefoot, laughing. The man, who had lost his father, dug a new row for seeds, pressing them into the soil as if into memory. Spring did not erase what had come before. It honoured it. The new green sprouted through last year's husks. The snowmelt carried soot from 100 fires into the stream. The first wildflowers rose from ground where stories had been told and bread had been broken. In the churchyard, the priest spoke gently of resurrection, not just of souls, but of seasons. He placed a flower on each grave that winter had claimed. He rang the bells louder now, not in mourning, but in rhythm with the blackbirds. And the people came. They brought eggs and herbs and wool. They brought laughter. They brought silence. Because there is a kind of quiet only found after long noise. A kind of stillness earned. It was felt in every budding tree, in the hands that mended roofs instead of cloaks, in the smiles exchanged over seed sacks and newborn lambs. The nobility too felt the change. The castle, once cold and dark, let in more light. The windows opened, the flags flew, horses were saddled again, hunts planned, feasts prepared, not in defiance, but in gratitude. In the monasteries, the gardens stirred. Monks knelt in the soil, planting sage, thyme, beans. Their chants, once muffled by stone, drifted through open cloisters like smoke through spring air. They sang of renewal, and the villagers sang too, not in choirs, but in humming while they worked, in lullabies for babies who had only known winter, in ballads with new verses, sung as they carried buckets and baskets through fields greening fast. They did not forget the cold. They remembered. They spoke of it, not as curse, but as test, of nights spent waiting, of stories told to stay awake, of neighbours who gave their last onion, of fires shared, of hands held, of the silence that had not broken them. Now the silence was gone, replaced by birdsong, by boots squelching in mud, by the creak of carts returning to road. Spring had arrived, and, in its warmth, everything that had seemed still now stirred, not quickly, not all at once, but deeply, and so they sowed, with reverence, with care, with gratitude carved into each seed, because spring was not the end of winter. It was winter's gift. When the days grew long again, and the fields whispered in green, winter did not vanish. It stepped back. It settled into the bones of cottages, into the lines etched on weathered hands, into the softened hush of voices that remembered cold without, needing to speak it. It lingered in ash, in scar, in song. Because winter, though brutal, was never truly gone. It lived in memory, in the smoke-blackened beams above the hearth, which no one cleaned fully, not for neglect, but for reverence. The black was proof that fire had once lived there. That warmth had once fought and won. It lived in stories told at the table. Do you remember the great frost? The year when the river froze through, when the snow reached the chapel door, when old Merrick walked 4 miles for a sack of oats and returned, with frostbitten ears but a heart full of laughter. These stories were told not as laments, but as legends. They were the people's epics, passed from lips to ears like folk songs, embellished over time, softened at the edges, but always true at their core. We survived. We endured. Together. Children listened wide-eyed. They had not felt the full sting of winter, not yet, but they would. And the stories prepared them. Not with fear, but with pride. This is who we are, they learned. We are those who wait through the snow, who break bread even when the loaf is thin, who sing when the nights are longest. Winter became a teacher. Its lessons were quiet, but deep. It taught patience, in the waiting for light. It taught care, in the way a fire must be fed just so. It taught humility, in the bowing of heads to snow that could not be resisted. And it taught love. Not love spoken in verse or carved into stone, but love lived. Love that rose early to stoke the hearth. Love that offered the larger portion to a shivering child. Love that knocked on a neighbour's door with stew when the stores were nearly gone. These were the kinds of love remembered, and they lasted longer than frost. They shaped custom. Why candles were lit on certain nights. Why a bit of bread was saved for the poor, even in spring. Why the first flower found in a thawed field was always left unpicked. In monasteries, scribes wrote of winters past with solemn ink, not as catastrophes, but as chronicles of faith. They noted the snowfall, the days of prayer, the number of souls lost, and the names of those born in cold. Winter was not only a season, it was a passage, from plenty to scarcity, from ease to test, from motion to stillness, and back again. The elders remembered most clearly. Their voices slowed when they spoke of it, not from age, but from respect. They remembered the storm that bent the trees, the cough that took a brother, the silence after a candle was blown out for the last time, but also the song that rose unexpectedly one evening, the shared blanket that saved a newborn, the loaf that was divided 6 ways, and filled everyone just enough. These memories were not heavy. They were held gently, as one holds a stone worn smooth from years of pocket and palm. Solid, silent, comforting. The people did not romanticize the suffering, but neither did they reject it. They carried it forward, in how they planted their seeds, in how they salted their meat, in how they taught their children to be strong and kind and quiet when listening for wind at the door. And each year, as winter approached again, they prepared. Not just with food and fire, but with memory. They lit the first candle of the season with a breath caught between fear and familiarity. They gathered close as the first frost came, not only to warm, but to remember. That winter was a part of them, that they were not its victims, but its witnesses. And when it passed, as it always did, they looked to the sky not with arrogance, but with gratitude. And perhaps late one evening, as summer waned and autumn crept in, a child might ask, "Tell me again about the time the snow fell for 7 days, when the fire nearly went out, when you held me and told me a story to keep me from crying." And the elder would smile, because that was the memory that mattered most, not the snow, nor the silence, nor even the suffering, but the story, kept alive, passed through smoke, carried in breath, held in hand, and now given to another. Winter ends, but its echo remains, not in cold, but in care, not in frost, but in fire, not in silence, but in the stories we choose to tell.